Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to touch on code standards and regulations. As I was talking to one of the attendees here, this is a topic we can spend talking about it for the whole day, but we just have 1 hour and I have 90 slides. So just bear with me here. All right, so this was the session description. So we're going to kind of I'm sure you understand this, that, since we are in this business of healthcare technology management or C or BME, a good understanding and knowledge of these standards and regulations is important. There are terms, code, standards, and regulations I'll try to define. These are the terms that tend to be used interchangeably. We do know that the healthcare field or, hospitals, they're regulated. There are a bunch of organizations that put out these so-called voluntary standards. Some are mandatory. We will talk about that, the difference between the two. And there are a lot of these laws, regulations, and practice guidelines that are out there, whether they pertain to specific types of devices, imaging, nuclear anesthesia, whatever, or electrical safety, fire safety, power distribution, medical gases in the hospitals, labs, and blood banks. So the purpose of this session is in no way make you an expert, but just give you an overview of what the code standards and regulations are. So if you want to dig deep into it, I've got a lot of references and links, hyperlinks in the presentation. And as this presentation is recorded and it's available after this expo ends, you can go through, dig deep into that. Feel free to stop me on the way. This is a brief introduction about me. You can look through that. So before we start, let's start with some polling questions just to get a feel of where the audience is in terms of their understanding. So first of all, just to find out how long you've been in the profession. So we have people from 0 to 10 years. Okay. All right, 11 to 20. Okay. And 20 plus. Okay, a lot of 20 pluses. Okay. All right. So this is a question I just wanted to get a feel from because it kind of gives me an idea how deep I need to go, although I have 1 hour limited here. How do you rate your knowledge of code standards and regulations as they pertain to HTM? Fair, good, or excellent? Fair, good, okay, excellent. Those people who raise their hand for excellent, they should help me out if I can't answer a question here. All right, okay, so this is a funny thing that I start off with. Sometimes I get laughs on it, sometimes I don't. But really, is it really the regulations are written for the good of the people? That's always a question mark, Okay, so let's talk about code, standards, and regulations, 3 different terms. And sometimes when we use them in our field, we tend to use them interchangeably. But there are proper definitions for each one of them. So what is a standard? When we talk about a standard, we're really talking about some kind of a minimum level of performance that is out there. Basically, we know it talks about standardized test methods, specifications, definitions, or practices. And the most important thing or takeaway with standards are most of these standards are voluntary, meaning you're not required to follow. This is a piece taken from ISO. Basically, it says standards are the distilled wisdom of people with expertise in their subject matter or subject area who know the needs of their organizations they represent. When these committees sit and develop these standards, they have people representing different aspects of that particular product requirement, or whatever. So they could be manufacturers, sellers, buyers, customers, the trade association, the users, and even regulators. The most common standards that we use in our field of HTM is obviously the Joint Commission standards. All of you know about that, the NFPA standards, AAMIF, CAP stands for College of American Pathologists. AABB, American Association of Blood Banks. This is the International Electrotechnical Commission, etc. There are quite a few of them. All right. So the key question is, as I said, most of the standards are voluntary. When is the compliance with that standard required? So the compliance is only mandatory when it's required by a thing called authority having jurisdiction, AAJ, authority having jurisdiction. So what is AAJ? AAJ is defined as an organization, office, or an individual that is responsible for enforcing the requirements of a code or a standard or for approving equipment. All right. So we kind of touched on standards. Let's jump into some examples. I'm going to quickly show you these, the Joint Commission standards, the AAMI-ANSI standard, blood bank, different other AAMI standards. So this is that example that I was giving you, and this is an example of Arizona Administrative Code. And if you look at this arrow here, this is a requirement for the hospital, healthcare institutions in the state of Arizona, and they are referencing these codes, NFPA 70, NFPA 101, which is the life safety code. So basically, what we're saying here is this particular state of Arizona requires these codes to be followed. So though these were voluntary, established by NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, but now they are a requirement for the hospitals in Arizona. So that's the concept here. Voluntary, but made a requirement by the authority having jurisdiction, which could be the state of Arizona, or it could be any of the states, could be the federal government, could be anybody else. Could be the local state fire marshal, could be the city of, I don't know, Florida, city of Orlando, or city of Los Angeles. Okay, now we tend to be kind of like think that the standards are something that are coming from somewhere, but they're not. There are limitations with the standards. And these are the things that you need to keep in mind is that the people who write these standards and even regulations and codes, they're based on past experience. You know, people who are sitting there can't predict what's in the future. 100 years ago, when they wrote the, or I don't know, 50 years ago, they wrote the California Motor Vehicle Code. They did not know whether they will have self-driving vehicles, right? So now they have self-driving vehicles in California and they're writing the code. So that's the key thing to remember is based on past experience and can inhibit modernization or limit progress. And the thing that you need to understand is what's the scope of that standard or code. It's limited and could be inappropriate for unforeseen situations because the people who are sitting on that committee that writes that code or standard only can speak what their experience is. They can't really foresee what's going to happen. And sometimes they don't know if there is something changes, and that's why we have this constant change in the standards that happens. So one of the things that not just a lot of people say is that you need to know, or it's very important to know, what's the origin of that particular standard? Why was it written? What's the background behind it? And when was it last revised? Because they tend to keep on changing. You're not going to go look at the 60 NFPA code for 99. No, I mean, you've got a newer version of the code. This is a kind of a neat thing here, and not a lot of people get involved with the development of standards and regulations because it requires a lot of time, money, which not a lot of individuals have. A lot of individuals in our profession don't even have money to come to the conference if their organization doesn't support, and smaller organizations cannot afford it. So sometimes these standards and codes are written by folks who tend to influence, whatever the parties are. I'm not going to mention names here too. Okay, so this is a quick checklist that I have on checking or when you're using standard, you need to know who developed it, how it was developed, when was it developed, when was it last revised, when it will be next revised, and where has it been used. And this is the key question: is it mandatory? I can write a standard, doesn't mean a thing. It has to be mandatory, and it has to be mandatory by some authority having jurisdiction. If Arif says that, doesn't mean a thing. It has to be an authority having jurisdiction. And you have to also remember these things. These are not perfect. Standards are not perfect. They have limitations. And the question is why you should be using it. Yeah, I should use it because Joint Commission says that. And since my hospital is Joint Commission accredited, I better follow it. Makes sense. Okay, so talked about standards, and let's talk about codes in the same vein here. Codes are kind of related to standards, and they're kind of like a system of standards, and they are related to a particular topic at hand. And they're usually written in a way that they would be adopted by the government or a private entity. They can take the whole code, say, okay, we're going to follow it, or they may take parts or sections of it or modify it. And again, just like with standards, the enforcement of code lies with the government, whether it's local, everybody understands it's like the city, county, whatever, state, and then the federal. All right, and again, the compliance is only required if it's required by an authority having jurisdiction. All right, examples, the ones we deal with a lot in our field of HTM or clinical engineering. NFPA 70, which is the National Electric Code. Do keep in mind, National Electric Code is not just for healthcare facilities, it's for a variety of facilities, hotels, buildings, industrial complex, homes, et cetera, et cetera. There's a section 517 in NFPA 70 that addresses healthcare facilities. This one, 99, is all about healthcare facilities. And last but not least is the life safety code, which is the fire safety code, basically, to do with all your fire protection measures, the smoke compartment, the fire exits, et cetera, et cetera. All right, here is an example. Everybody knows this, NFPA 70. That's it's a 2020 edition of the National Fire Protection Association. It's a recognized standard for any and all buildings about electrical requirements in the United States. But what the state of California does, they take this code and make it the 2022 California Electric Code. Now, this was not a requirement, but this, because California adopted it, and the way California adopted it, I mean, I've got the fine print here, if you can read this, it's the California Electric Code is a fully integrated California specific code based on the 2020 National Electric Code. So they basically take most of the content from here and modify parts of it to apply to California. All right, and this is the other one that all of us are familiar with, your NFPA 99, which is the Healthcare Facilities Code, the 2021 edition. All right, everybody knows about CMS. There's only one M here. It's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Service. It's a department, or I believe an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. They certify hospitals for the Medicare and Medicaid payments. And if you go to their website, I don't have the actual link, but you can Google it. It basically says that the basic life safety code for fire protection, fire requirements in the facilities participating in the Medicare and Medicaid programs should be in compliance with the 2012 edition of NFPA LSC, which is the Life Safety Code, and HCFC, which is the Healthcare Facilities Code, the codes I just showed you. So here you go again. So these two codes, LSC and HCFC, if your hospital is accredited by CMS, you better follow these. And they specify the edition that needs to be followed. So this becomes a requirement. All right, so now the next one, that's relatively easy, the regulations, the government agencies, any document that's issued by a government entity. And the way they do it, as I gave you the example of the Arizona code, they use the word code, as I said, they use the word interchangeably. They would include whole or part of the standard or use a reference to that standard and code. And the key thing is, when a regulation is passed by a state, it has the force of law from the start. They are the authority having jurisdiction. And what are the examples? Everybody's familiar with the CFRs, Code of Federal Regulations. And I didn't have the place here to put all the 50 states, but these are some of the examples of the different regulations that are out there. And again, you can see the word code and regulation is kind of used interchangeably the way they understood in different states. All right, Code of Federal Regulations, very easy. If you just have the computer, internet access, you can go through and look at all the titles that are out there for free, get them. Okay, so this is a question that comes up all the time. Are Joint Commission standards mandatory? Simple answer is no. But the key thing is third-party payers, which are your insurance, your Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they require Joint Commission accreditation. Actually, I should say Joint Commission and other accrediting bodies, they accept their accreditation. So this is a little bit about Joint Commission here. And it's kind of an interesting thing that this happened. I'm going to show you a picture. When the Social Security amendments were passed way back in 1965, and Joint Commission was around then, they basically had a provision in the law that said that any hospital, they permitted the hospitals that are accredited by Joint Commission, because Joint Commission was offering the accreditation way before 65. They said, okay, you know what, any hospital that's accredited by Joint Commission is deemed to be in compliance with these conditions of participation. So they were basically grandfathered. And what this provided these hospitals was an alternate path, which a lot of people consider, or a lot of hospitals consider preferable than going through state surveys, which they have to go through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and they have the state agencies in different states that can do that on behalf of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, because they have to qualify for the Medicare, which is the program, federal program. All of us pay for this program in our paychecks for the seniors, and this is for the people who are in need of financial assistance. All right, and the term that is used by CMS, or Center for Medicare Services, is the conditions of participation, and they are contained in this document. Title 42, Code of Federal Regulations, Section 482. All right, quiz. Can anybody guess who this person is? Okay, who's this president? He's one of the presidents. Truman, yes. All right, so when this thing was signed, as I was talking to you, the Medicare Program Social Security Administration 65, he signed this document at the LGB, he signed this at the LBJ, this is a courtesy from LBJ Presidential Library. He had the former president come in and when he signed this document. Okay, all right, a little history there. Okay, so let's talk about this 42 CFR 482. Long document, we don't have the time to do it, but the one that really pertains to us for medical equipment is this small section here. And I apologize that you cannot probably read it. I'll try to read it here. Facilities, supplies, and equipment must be maintained to ensure an acceptable level of safety and quality. That's what it says. And the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services has come up with this document, which is called the State's Operation Manual, and its regulations and interpretation. And you can, if you read this, they have all this pertaining to different sections of 482 about medical staff and nursing and pharmacy, blah, blah, blah. And if you want to look at the actual document, it's a couple of hundred pages. It's available on the CMS website. All right, so let's jump back here and try to divide the world of organizations that are involved in code, standards, and regulations. As I said, there are voluntary organizations, the people who have an interest behind a product, a service, or some element within the healthcare facilities. They're called the so-called voluntary organizations. And these other things you're all clear with. Federal agencies, it's not just one agency, multiple agencies, 50 different states, and local agencies, large cities like Chicago, LA, I believe New York. I mean, they have their own set of requirements. All right, so these are a list of different voluntary organizations that are out there. Some of them may apply to your organizations, others may not. From Joint Commission to CAP. I mean, College of American Pathologists specifically is there for the lab. Some hospitals choose CAP accreditation. I know our hospital was at one time, and then they switched it back to Joint Commission. AABB, if your hospital has a blood bank, it has to follow those standards. NFPA, AAMI. There are osteopathic hospitals that follow this AOA, then UL, some international standards. And if you're an ambulatory care, there are other organizations as well. So there I have a plug here. And if you want, myself and a couple of my colleagues gave a presentation at AAMI, and this kind of talks about all the Joint Commission standards, which was by itself an hour long. So it's actually a good slides along with presentation, so you can look through. And they have a pause till 14-minute, 30 seconds. So after that, you can listen. And it's kind of a nice presentation, gives you a complete overview of Joint Commission standards, as well as the interpretation, how to prepare, and all that. Okay, so let's talk about the CMS regulations that we were talking about. And everybody knows about power strips. I don't want to open that can of worms here, but Life Safety Code Survey uses the use of power strips in healthcare facilities, and this is that requirement that is spelled out in this document. I'm trying to publicize this particular product, but they have a nice article kind of talking about, it's like a pamphlet, I think, or a white paper they wrote on power strips. So you can read through that as well. All right, this is the term deemed status. What does that mean? If you look very carefully at the Joint Commission standards, they have two sets of standards, one for deemed status hospitals, the other is for the non-deemed status hospitals. So most of the hospitals in the private sector are referred to as deemed status because they get their reimbursement through the federal government's Medicare program. I work for VA, military, our funding is different, so we're not deemed hospitals, though we follow Joint Commission standards. So that's the distinction, just so that we're clear on. Anyway, point is that I was just making here, and so all the details are here. I'm just going to highlight some of them. For healthcare organization to get in and partake payment for Medicare and Medicaid, they must be complying with this thing called the COPs, conditions of participation. And these are the standards that are stated in the federal regulations, and we talked about that earlier. And this is only accomplished by a site survey that's done either by the state agency on behalf of CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or you have an alternate, you can have one of these accreditation organizations like Joint Commission, DNV, and others who can do that and verify that. And CMS, by the way, and there are a bunch of links here, you can look through it. They every, I guess, 2 or 3 years, review the list of the so-called deeming organizations with Joint Commission, DNV, and there's a list. I'm going to come down to that in the next slide. And they give them what they refer to as a deemed status. It's not like for life. So they have to go through a process of review, and their organization is reviewed, their standards are reviewed, their survey process is reviewed, and they're basically given a 3-year deemed status authority. So these are the CMS approved accrediting organizations. Obviously, you know this one. These are other ones too. And if you want to look at the complete list, it's available on the CMS website. And as I said again, I'm pretty sure it's every 3 years, but it's either every 2 years or 3 years. They republish the list of the organizations they deem that is deemed. They publish the list of the organizations that have the deeming authority. Okay, so let's jump in talking about Joint Commission. I showed you the link for one of the presentations that we did to NFPA. NFPA has been around for a long time, and NFPA just doesn't write standards just for healthcare, right? For everything, anything and everything that has got to do with fire and other risks in buildings. Bunch of codes and standards, I guess that's the number. And they virtually influence every building, process, service, design, and installation in the United States. You have fire extinguishers, you have a standard for that, sprinkler systems, there's a standard for that, and so on and so forth. But for us in the HTM field, these are the ones that we need to be actively involved with, particularly this 99. And as I said, in the installation of the electrical system, the section 516 of NFPA 70. All right, so this is the 2012 edition. This is the 2021 edition of NFPA. And the reason I'm bringing this up is different editions of this code are referenced. This is the latest one, I believe, yes. But if you look at the document that I shared with you from the CMS website, they're referring the 2012 edition. And they have a 3-year revision cycle. All right. So I have extracted a couple of slides or a couple of snapshots from NFPA 99. If you go in chapter 10, talks about electrical equipment. And this is, it applies to the performance, maintenance, and testing of electrical equipment in new and existing healthcare facilities. All right, and then it talks about those, the so-called electrical safety limits that we have. Those are spelled out in here for patient care related electrical appliances, talks about the physical integrity, resistance, and all that. You can look through that. Also talks about the lead leakage currents and all that. Those are listed in here in the standard as well. All right, so these are the agencies that reference and enforce the NFPA 99. So obviously this one we just talked about, Joint Commission, Accreditation Commission for Healthcare, CMS, DNV, and a bunch of other states. Actually, I was preparing for this presentation, I came across this link and they kind of list all the states actually that reference the NFPA 99. So if you're from other states, you can actually, as you can see here, the city of Los Angeles, larger cities, as I said, they also have the reference to this code. And there's some with amendments and some without amendments. So they just take wholesale without amendments, or they may take some and modify it as well. All right, so let's jump into, after talking about voluntary organizations, let's talk about the federal agencies. So these are some of the federal agencies. I mean, again, this is not the exhaustive list in any way, fashion for all the federal agencies that are there, but these are the federal agencies that we kind of sort of deal with, I guess. FDA, everybody knows about FDA. It's a big agency. Everybody knows about that, do more than just regulating medical devices, vaccines, blood products, food products, all those things. FCC. What's the involvement of FCC? We'll come to that. OSHA, NRC. NRC does a lot of things, including regulating nuclear power plants, but they're involved in nuclear medicine too, if you have a nuclear medicine department. I'll come to that. And then CMS. All right, so let's talk about FDA for a second. And again, this is in no way an exhaustive explanation of what FDA is. Best place really, if you want to go dig deep into it, what FDA regulates, you go to fda.gov and there are tons of information. The ones that pertain to HTM is that they regulate medical devices, which basically means that, I can't in my garage make a medical device and sell it to the hospital. It's not allowed. It was allowed way back in the, I guess, 60s or 70s till the 1976 regulations came in, and now it's a regulated product by which, if you are an organization or if you are an importer of medical devices, you need to be registered with the FDA. There are certain requirements that are spelled out. Safe Medical Devices Act, all of us are familiar with it. Got a little history here. We'll talk about that in a second. Medical device recalls, though recalls is the responsibility of the manufacturer per the regulations. FDA has the jurisdiction of classifying the recalls. Even you talk about the class 1 recall, class 2 recall, etc. That's what FDA does. Blood banks too. You cannot operate a blood bank in your hospital unless it's licensed by the FDA. There's a requirement for that. Those of you who are involved with the imaging side of the house, Title 21 talks about the report for assembly. And if your facility has mammography equipment, there are mammography standards acts too. So these are some common ones that we deal with at the hospital. So FDA's role in regulating medical device, this is the link, tons of information there. Basically, as I said earlier, FDA regulates the sale of medical products and monitors the safety of all regulated products. In the United States, they sell, before a medical device can be legally sold, I can sell the device illegally, but if it is sold legally, the person or the company that wants to sell the device must seek approval from the FDA. All right, so bunch of information here, link is here. There's information about the medical device regulation, reporting regulation changes, and these things keep on changing. So some link here for you to look through. I'll just take a minute here to talk about SMDA. It's been around for, I guess, almost 30 plus years, I guess. Safe Medical Devices Act. I remember that when I was in college learning about it. So there's a requirement from the Food and Drug Administration. It's a law that was passed by Congress. Basically says the user facilities, which are your hospitals, if there is a device-related death, you have to report it to the FDA and the device manufacturer and the medical. And if it's a serious injury, it should be to the manufacturer. And if you don't know the manufacturer, it has to be reported to the FDA. And every year you have to provide a summary to the FDA of those incidents. And if you need more information, here is the link. So that's the user reporting requirement of the SMDA, which is the Safe Medical Devices Act. This is a clip I kind of came across. Look at the date here, 1991, before the SMDA was passed. So the origin behind this is kind of an interesting piece of history. If I can take 10 seconds to talk about it. They had these valves, heart valves in patients, which were failing. And they did not have a clue which patient it was, where that patient was. So the second component of the SMDA was device tracking. So if you go to a hospital and if you are implanted, say, one of these devices here, which I'm going to show you this one here, bunch of these devices here, they have to be tracked. So it was the pacemaker or defibrillator or one of these nice, I don't know if you can see that at the back, bunch of things from heart valves to simulators to other implantable defibrillators, breast prostheses, electrodes. You have to keep a track of the name of the person. So it's Arif, where his information is. So God forbid there is a recall on that device, they can track that person down and make that person known about it. Okay, so what I was saying is that, bottom line here was with this SMDA is that it was signed into law on November 28th. And this federal law made the manufacturers of life-sustaining implants responsible for maintaining patient registries. So you keep a track of those patients, because if there is a recall, just like a recall that happens in the hospital, they have to go look for these patients. The patients may have moved. Okay, and this will be a major task because, and this is 1990, and at that time only, it's not only, 1.5 million people had implanted device each year in the United States alone. And 23, 10, so it's 33 years have passed. I think I couldn't really find the number of how many implanted devices people get every year. Probably it's in the order of tens of millions of people get different types of devices. So keeping track of them. And this is that FDA document you can look through, which talks about medical device tracking. And this is that particular section. And the idea, as I just mentioned, is this enables the FDA to require a manufacturer to promptly identify the product distribution information and remove the device from the market. And it specifically states that a failure that will likely cause serious adverse health or consequences and intended to be implanted in the human body for more than 1 year, and it is a life-sustaining or life-supporting devices like implantable pacemakers, implantable defibrillators, heart valves, etc. And this was that list I was talking to you about. This is a kind of a neat document, kind of old, but talks about how you implement Safe Medical Devices Act. Okay, so let's jump into from SMDA or Safe Medical Devices Act here to medical device recalls. All of you get these medical device recalls from the manufacturer. If they have your correct address, sometimes it goes to the user, sometimes it may go to your purchasing department, logistics department, you name it. Or you may subscribe to one of those subscriptions that are out there through ECRI or some other places where they give you a summary of those recalls. The job of the FDA is obviously when a manufacturer is required, if they find something, to submit that recall to the users and then notify this organization called the FDA, which assigns the recall a classification. Based on the information provided by the manufacturer, they would classify that as 1, 2, and 3. These are Roman 1, 2, and 3. And basically, these are relative of the degree of risk that recall has. Obviously, I'm going to read through the text here, but bottom line is class 1 is with a serious health problems or death, slight chance cause serious problems or death, which is class 2, and class 3 is the lowest, not likely to cause a health problem. So 1 is the serious recall and class 3 is the lowest level of classification, and all the details are spelled out here on this fda.gov website. All right, and this is that website. You can read through it, and you can go through actually and look at the current recalls too, and they provide you with a database of the previous recalls that they have received. And these recalls, if you go through, these are medical device recalls, but there is another link somewhere on the FDA website that has recall information of other products too. So if that, I don't know, that cake or that ice cream or whatever food product that had a recall, it will be there on the FDA website because FDA regulates that aspect of our lives as well. Okay, so let's jump into now blood bank and products. Blood bank, blood products. Actually, there's a division. I don't know if I have the name of the division here listed or not. Is the Center for Biological something. And those are the ones that are responsible for the regulate. Yeah, this is it. Centers for Biologic Evaluation and Research, CBER. The one that we are involved with the medical devices is the CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So as you all know, blood is quite important. So they regulate the collection of blood components that are used for transfusion, manufacture of pharmaceuticals and all those details in here. And then the related products such as cell separating devices, which we get involved with, containers to collect them, and the HIV screening tests. And they also develop and enforce quality standards because blood has to be maintained at a certain temperature, certain environment. And what they do, and some of you may have experienced that in your hospital, I mean, it's like a small entity, you know, blood bank, where they inspect the blood bank establishment. and they monitor for their reports, errors, accidents, and clinical events. It's, I think, every 2 years they come in, FDA, to inspect your blood bank facility. Yeah, every 2 years they come in, and if there are problems with the facility, obviously they would come more often. So basically, the requirement of the standard, which is spelled out in this document, that Title 21 Code of Federal Regulation 607.65 says all owners or operators of establishments that manufacture blood products are required to register with the FDA to pursuant of this. A list of every blood product manufactured, prepared, or processed for commercial distribution must also be submitted. So what does it affect us? Actually, this regulation, Title 21, 606 section, pertains. There is a section on equipment, and I don't know if you can read this through. I have a link here somewhere, or you can just Google this section. Has certain requirements for centrifuges, autoclaves, and all those other devices, how often the performance check should be done and calibration should be done. And this is where you can just have to follow these requirements per the Code of Federal Regulation. Okay, talking about blood banks, let's jump in and talk about labs. You may have heard about CLIA, Clinical Laboratory Improvement Act, another law passed in 1988. This is referred also to as the Public Law 100-578. And the idea behind this was that these labs were doing tests and giving out results for simple things like blood, urine, and other body fluids incorrectly. So they required them that there should be some kind of an accuracy on those results, some reliability on those tests that we are getting. And they established these quality standards. And basically the idea was that all entities, all labs that perform these tests on specimens obtained obviously from us, humans. Okay, these tests commonly performed in labs are regulated under CLIA, are tests for the blood, urine, and other samples to detect cancer, HIV, diabetes, and other diseases. And as you can realize, they're pretty important. And we can't just have people doing the testing without some kind of a standard. So this organization, which we talked about earlier, CMS, they regulate all laboratory testing, except research performed on human use through this law. And this CLIA law, by the way, is kind of a quite a high number here, close to 330,000 lab entities. And there's a little article here, which I think I wrote way back. You can look at it and gives you more details about it. So let's talk about this one here. Oops. Okay, so if you go under the Title 42 Code of Federal Regulation, this basically lists the standards or requirements for your testing of laboratory equipment. And the key thing to remember here is that you can't use your own, whatever method of determining the PM frequency risk criteria or whatever. It says the maintenance is defined by the manufacturer and at least with the frequency established by the manufacturer. Very clear cut here, and kind of gives you all the details behind it. Labs are pretty highly regulated devices. All right, so let's see here. So this is now jumping from lab to imaging equipment, diagnostic equipment. They produce radiation, they're regulated, and that's all spelled out in the Title 21. And these are certain pieces that I kind of did a snapshot, again, no way, excuse me, to give you the whole perspective here, but in section or part 1020, they talk about the performance standards of these radiation emitting devices which have the ionizing radiation, which has the risk, as you know, of cancer. All right, so they have this section and you can go through the details, and they talk about tubing assemblies, applicability, all that information that needs to be provided for the users. And this is that section that talks about that the manufacturers are required to provide for the manuals and instruction sheet, including technical and safety information. All right, so, and again, this is just a snapshot. Obviously, there are other extra devices out there, so you can look through and look at the more details behind it. So in 1992, another set of equipment that we deal with, not I guess in all hospitals, but most of the hospitals, is the mammography equipment. And again, what was happening was that because of the very nature of mammography equipment and the detection of cancer and all that, it wasn't, it wasn't meeting the quality standards that it needs to. So in 1992, this MQSA, or the Mammography Quality Standards Act, was passed, and which basically set up national quality standards for mammography, and basically said that if your facility has a mammography machine, then you better be accredited by an approved accrediting body. You can't just install a mammography unit and perform mammography. It kind of laid out certain requirements that you need to have a qualified medical physicist who surveys the facility's equipment, to oversee the equipment related QC program used by the facility. They need to go through an annual on-site physics consultation and evaluation survey that's performed by a qualified medical physicist, and all the details are kind of spelled out in this requirement. Some of you may get involved directly with this, or some may know indirectly. Sometimes it's the radiology department who may be on their own doing this stuff. All right, so we talked about FCC, Federal Communications Commission, or wireless communication, they regulate. So this is way back. They came up with this thing called the WMTS, which is the Wireless Medical Telemetry Service. And they specified these bands. I'm sorry, I have to go through close here to read this. These are the frequency ranges: 608 to 614, 1395 to 1400, 1427 to 432 megahertz. And these are used for remote monitoring in your hospital. So these are the referred to as the WMTS, that is established by FCC as for dedicated use of medical telemetry. And they authorized this organization, which some of you may be familiar with, ASHE, the American Society of Healthcare Engineering, and they act as the so-called coordinator, frequency coordinator, and they have this link here. So, for example, if you have existing hospital, a new hospital, and you're going through a process of installing wireless telemetry service, you have to go through and get your equipment registered here. This is the link here, and basically what they do is, as I mentioned, they created this WMTS, which is the Wireless Medical Telemetry System, in response to growing concern about the interference. So what happened when digital televisions were introduced? They started having interference in that particular bands that they were operating in other equipment. And what FCC did was they dedicated bands of frequencies to promote the interference-free use of medical telemetry systems that were important for the patient monitoring. And it's a mandate from FCC that all WMTS transmitters must be registered, and they appointed ASHE, which is the American Society of Healthcare Engineering, as the frequency coordinator for handling the registration. And ASHE and its technical partner, they hired a firm called ComSearch to provide frequency coordination services and device registration. All right, so this is the link to that, this is the link to that website. You can read through and learn about it. In fact, if you want to go, you can go to this link, and there is a document there where you can find that your hospital will be registered there. And if you don't know what they will tell you, what the frequency it was registered to. So this is all in here. All right, so let's talk about OSHA. Now, OSHA is something that is not necessarily to healthcare, but it's to all industries. So a little bit about OSHA. Way back in '70, the OSHA Act was passed, and the idea was to promote the safe and healthful working conditions of workers, and enforcing the standards and providing for training, outreach, education, and assistance. It's part of the United States Department of Labor, and basically the idea behind the OSHA Act is it provides for private sector employees and their workers, in addition to some public sector employees and workers in 50 states and jurisdictions that are under the federal authority. And you can look at this link in here. The most common, excuse me, the most common requirement is spelled out in the section 5 of the OSHA Act. Basically, it says to the employer, which is your hospital in the case or any other organization, that each employer shall furnish to each of its employees employment and a place of employment that is free from recognized hazards that can cause or likely cause death or serious physical harm to its employees, and complies with the OSHA Act that was promulgated with it, and then uh, the other requirements that are spelled out. Okay, so OSHA also gets involved with the quarterly radiation limits. Some of you may have this radiation badge that they monitor. So just real quick on that one, without going into radiation physics or ionizing radiation here, basically per Title 29 of the Code of Federal Regulation, REMS is the unit that is used. I'll come to that in a second. Per quarter, the limit is 1.25. For the whole body, for hands, forearms, it's 18.75, and skin and whole body is 7.5. And REM is that unit that we use in the United States, and it stands for, or is an abbreviation for, Roentgen equivalent man. It's a non-SI unit, and it's predominantly used in the United States. I'm making a particular point here because outside the United States, they use a different unit for radiation protection. I'll show you in a second. So the definition of REM is it represents equivalent biological effect that is deposited on 100 ergs or 1 rad of gamma rays in a kilogram of body tissue. And if you want to go through the details, it's available in there. All right, so let's talk about USNRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Started in 1974 for the safe use of radioactive materials. Now, if you don't have a nuclear medicine department, you probably don't have to deal with it. Obviously, we're not dealing with nuclear plants, but the things that we're dealing with is nuclear medicine. You know, your gamma camera and all that equipment that you have in your nuclear, and they have certain requirements for regulating that. You've heard of the hot lab and all that. So NRC actually has a nice slide presentation, and this is really taken from their website. And the section that pertains to some nuclear facts is that down here, obviously it's used in nuclear power industry, and small amount of radioactive material is in smoke detectors and other things. Nuclear materials are used in medicine for cancer treatment and diagnosis. And on the average, this is some radiation facts. The average person in the United States is exposed to about 620 milligram of radiation per year. Half of that exposure comes from natural sources, which is your background radiation. And the other half comes from the medical exams. Some radiation facts here for medical procedures. About 36% is the sources for radiation that are coming from medical procedures. All right. So if you're involved with, for example, X-rays, setting up of X-ray rooms, or designing of X-ray rooms, there's an organization called the NCRP, which is the National Council for Radiation Protection. And they publish these reports. This was chartered by Congress in '64 as part of the NCRP. And basically they have something they have for the shielding. You know, you need to have a shielding. If you install an X-ray room in this, you need to set up the shielding. And those shielding requirements are established in this report number 147. And basically it provides recommendations and technical information related to the design and installation of structural shielding to facilities that use X-rays for medical imaging. It's again a very thick document. I just have certain sections of it in here that kind of defines you the purpose. Basically, the purpose is to limit the shielding exposure to employees, because if you have an X-ray unit here, I mean, there are patients walking around, staff walking around, you need to provide that protection. And that's defined in this document, as I mentioned, in 147. In the past, you may be familiar, they used to have this document called 49 that was not recently revised a couple of years ago, or actually at least a decade ago, I think. The bottom line is that you're talking about the barrier thickness, the lead shields that are required, you know, above the location and all those details. So there's a section within this document called the Fundamentals of Shielding for Medical X-ray Imaging. And basically they talk about two things in here, the primary radiation and the primary barrier. So what is primary radiation? We're going into X-rays here without going into too much detail. It's that useful beam that comes out from an X-ray machine directly from the X-ray tube, and that is used for the imaging of the patient. And what's the primary barrier? So let's pretend this is the X-ray units coming here. So this will be the primary barrier here. This is that wall. It could be in the ceiling too, or other structure that intercepts that radiation from that X-ray tube. And the basic idea is that it's going to attenuate that X-ray source, because we don't want this radiation to go to another room where somebody would get that radiation unnecessarily. And we have to do the appropriate shielding of this document. So this is a picture, actually a figure taken from that document. So here you got the X-ray tube. This is the primary source. This is the patient here getting the primary. And then you got the scattered, which is the second scattered radiation. Basically what scattered radiation is, that down in here, when the X-ray beam hits that patient, it's reflected off it. So this barrier in here that is based on the shielding requirements is referred to as the secondary barrier. This is the one that's the primary barrier, and it has a certain thickness based on the standard that we spelled out earlier. Also, you can notice there's leakage radiation too. Although this X-ray tube may be shielded, there may be some leakage radiations coming out from it. So this is an illustration of the primary, this radiation which is used for X-rays, and then scattered radiation, leakage radiation, and the transmitted, the one that can go through the patient out to through this barrier. And the purpose of this thickness of this barrier, I don't know if you can see through the, this is a little thinner than this one. It provides for that barrier for that radiation. So what's secondary radiation? We just talked about. It's the one that is scattered from the patient and other objects, and the leakage radiation from other protective housing, such as the X-ray tube. Secondary barrier is the wall, ceiling, floor, other structure that will intercept and attenuate leakage of scattered radiation. The idea is that you don't need to put as much thickness of lead in those so-called secondary barriers. Okay, so what are the factors that affect radiation exposure? This is a kind of an important thing to know if you're working in the area of imaging, is the dose. How much is the dose or the amount of radiation produced by that X-ray source? Just looking at the time here so that I don't want to run out of time. Just, oh, only two minutes? All right, and then the other one is the distance between the exposed person and the source, amount of time, how long can you, there's X-ray source coming here, I'm standing here for 1 minute versus 10 minutes, and the amount of protective shielding that I have. Concept of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, that's available on here. Basically, the idea is you get the least possible dose to get your X-ray exposure. This is a good YouTube video I came across, so I recommend you looking at it. It talks about the different doses of absorbed dose, equivalent dose, and effective dose. So absorbed dose is the amount of energy deposited per unit, and the units of absorbed dose are gray. These are the international units, and red, as I said, is the US unit. So this is another link here. I'll let you guys read as we're running out of time. Units about effective dose. I'll skip through this, sorry. Okay, so this is something very interesting. I just pulled this up from a link here. Idea is that how high an X-ray exposure could be with a CT chest versus you do a simple chest X-ray or a dental X-ray. Some of the resources you can look at, again, get more information. There are tons of other resources out there in the public arena. And that concludes my presentation. Sorry, I had to rush it at the end. Thank you.